Hail Internet! It's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings series. And we're talking about the sixth and final battle in the Wars of Beleriand, the War of Wrath. The battle that ends the First Age. I've done videos on each of the first 5 battles, and I'll post links to those videos in the description, but just to quickly catch us up. In 472 of the First Age, the good guys suffer an overwhelming defeat in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the 5th battle in the Wars of Beleriand. And I should note that there is a reason for the battle's name, other than that it sounds cool, and undoubtedly many tears were indeed shed. The name comes from a line in the Doom of Mandos. When Mandos issued his prophecy/curse to the Noldor, it included this phrase: "Tears unnumbered ye shall shed, and the Valar will fence Valinor against you, and shut you out, so that not even the echo of your lamentation shall pass over the mountains." That's notable, because by calling that battle the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the elves are acknowledging that the doom of Mandos is upon them, and that they're fated to fail. And sure enough, in the years that follow, various elven realms are destroyed. Círdan's realm of the Falas is overrun. Thingol's realm of Doriath falls through the actions of dwarves and fellow elves. Nargothrond falls to Glaurung, father of dragons. And finally, in 510 of the First Age, less than 40 years after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, Gondolin tragically falls. And so now Morgoth controls almost the entire map of Beleriand. Many of the elves lucky enough to survive these various defeats flee to the havens of Sirion on the coast. One notable resident of the havens of Sirion is Elwing, the granddaughter of Beren and Luthien. And she is the current holder of a Silmaril, passed down from her grandparents after they cut it from Morgoth's crown. Unfortunately, there are still 4 surviving sons of Feanor, intent on taking back their father's handiwork. And Morgoth is content to let the elves finish themselves off. Silmarillion, Chapter 23. But Morgoth thought that his triumph was fulfilled, recking little of the sons of Feanor and of their oath, which had harmed him never, and turned always to his mightiest aid. And in his black thought he laughed, regretting not the one Silmaril he had lost, for by it he had deemed the last shred of the people of the Eldar should vanish from Middle-earth, and trouble it no more. If he knew of the dwelling by the waters of Sirion, he gave no sign, biding his time, and waiting upon the working of oath and lie. Yet by Sirion and the sea there grow up an elven folk, the gleanings of Doriath and Gondolin, and from Valar the mariners of Círdan came among them, and they took to the waves and the building of ships. So we see that Morgoth regrets not the one Silmaril he had lost, because it means strife among his enemies. And sure enough, in 538, less than 30 years after the fall of Gondolin, the sons of Feanor ransack the havens of Sirion. Only 2 of the sons survive, Maedhros and Maglor. We'll come back to them later. But in their unforgivable assault on their own people, known as the Third Kinslaying, they were still unsuccessful at acquiring the Silmaril, because Elwing leaped into the sea with the stone. She was saved from drowning by the Vala Ulmo, a Neptune-like figure. He transformed her into a white bird, and she joined her husband, Earendil, on his ship, the Vingalot, importantly, bringing the Silmaril with her. I know this is a long intro to the actual War of Wrath, but it is important for context. Hearing from Elwing that now even the havens of Sirion have been lost, Earendil and Elwing sail for Valinor to request aid from the Valar. Several of the next quotes will be from Chapter 24 of the Silmarillion. Yet Earendil saw now no hope left in the lands of Middle-earth, And he turned again in despair, and came not home, but sought back once more to Valinor, with Elwing at his side. He stood now most often at the prow of Vingalot, and the Silmaril was bound upon his brow, and ever its light grew greater as they drew into the west. And the wise have said that it was by reason of the power of that holy jewel that they came in time to waters that no vessels, save those of the Teleri, had known. And they came to the enchanted isles, and escaped their enchantment. And they came into the shadowy seas, and passed their shadows. And they looked upon Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle, but tarried not, and at the last they cast anchor in the bay of Eldamar. And the Teleri saw the coming of that ship out of the east, and they were amazed, gazing from afar upon the light of the Silmaril. It was very great. Then Earendil, first of living men, landed on the immortal shores. We see how important the Silmaril was to Earendil and Elwing's quest. Without it, they have zero chance of finding the shores of Aman. The enchanted isles, the shadowy seas, and so forth would have kept them searching indefinitely. Earendil then makes a plea to the Valar to save Middle-earth from Morgoth. And since his motives seem altruistic, the Valar spare him, even though he's a mere mortal daring to meet with them. However, even though they spare his life, they tell him he can never set foot back in Middle-earth. Instead, he and the Silmaril are sent to the heavens aboard his flying ship Vingalot, where he acts as the evening star, Venus, flying across the night sky. What's great about that is that both Morgoth and the surviving sons of Feanor see the Silmaril in the sky. The same stone that was cut from Morgoth's crown. The same stone that Maedhros and Maglor killed all those elves for. And Tolkien gives us their reactions to this completely unexpected event. Now, when first Vingalot was set to sail in the seas of heaven, it rose unlooked for, glittering and bright. And the people of Middle-earth beheld it from afar and wondered, and they took it for a sign, and called it Gil Estel, the star of high hope. And when this new star was seen at evening, Maedhros spoke to Maglor his brother, and he said, "Surely that is a Silmaril that shines now in the west?" And Maglor answered, "If it be truly the Silmaril which we saw cast into the sea, that rises again by the power of the Valar, then let us be glad. For its glory is seen now by many, and is yet secure from all evil." Then the elves looked up, and despaired no longer. But Morgoth was filled with doubt. Yet it is said that Morgoth looked not for the assault that came upon him from the west. For so great was his pride become, that he deemed that none would ever again come with open war against him. Moreover, he thought he had forever estranged the Noldor from the lords of the west, and that content in their blissful realm, the Valar would heed no more his kingdom in the world without. For to him that is pitiless, the deeds of pity are ever strange and beyond reckoning. I like the simplicity of the line, Morgoth was filled with doubt. I mean, that had to be an oh no moment for him. This gem that was inches from his face for years is now somehow sailing amongst the stars. Does not bode well for the bad guys. But we see that Morgoth's pride keeps him from anticipating the Valar's next move. And we get that great line. For to him that is pitiless, the deeds of pity are ever strange and beyond reckoning. I did a video on the Hobbit's capacity for empathy, or pity. It was pity that stayed his hand, Bilbo's. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. Tolkien shows that Sauron's lack of empathy, pity, is in many ways his downfall in the War of the Ring. And here we see it leading to Morgoth's downfall in the upcoming War of Wrath. Here's a description of the army that sets out from Aman. But the host of the Valar prepared for battle, and beneath their white banners marched the Vanyar, the people of Ingwe, and those also of the Noldor who never departed from Valinor, whose leader was Finarfin, the son of Finwë. Few of the Teleri were willing to go forth to war, for they remembered the slaying at the Swanhaven. But they hearkened to Elwing, come of their own kindred, and they sent mariners enough to sail the ships that bore the host of Valinor east over the sea. Yet they stayed aboard their vessels, and none of them set foot upon the hitherlands. So the Vanyar elves and the Noldor who chose not to follow Feanor all those years ago are now heading east as part of an impressive army. One of their leaders, Finarfin, is Galadriel's father. The Teleri elves are still rightfully outraged by the first kinslaying when the Noldor attacked them and stole their precious ships. So they agree to provide the transportation for the army, but they refuse to set foot on Middle-earth. Of the march of the host of the Valar to the north of Middle-earth, little is said in any tale. For among them went none of those elves who had dwelt and suffered in the hitherlands, and who made the histories of those days that are still known. And tidings of these things they only learned long afterwards from their kinsfolk in Aman. But at the last, the might of Valinor came up out of the west, and the challenge of the trumpets of Eönwë filled the sky. And Beleriand was ablaze with the glory of their arms, for the host of the Valar were arrayed in forms young and fair and terrible, and the mountains rang beneath their feet. The meeting of the hosts of the west and of the north is named the Great Battle and the War of Wrath. There was marshaled the whole power of the throne of Morgoth, and it had become great beyond count, so that Anfauglith could not contain it, and all the north was aflame with war. But it availed him not. The Balrogs were destroyed, save some few that fled and hid themselves in caverns inaccessible at the roots of the earth. And the uncounted legions of the orcs perished like straw in a great fire, or were swept like shriveled leaves before a burning wind. Few remained to trouble the world for long years after, and such few as were left of the three houses of the elf friends, fathers of men, fought upon the part of the Valar, and they were avenged in those days for Barahir, Huor, and Hurin, and many others of their lords. But a great part of the sons of men, whether of the people of Uldor or others new come out of the east, marched with the enemy, and the elves do not forget it. I love that change of tense right there at the end. The whole time this war is being described in the past tense, but when it mentions how several of the Easterlings fought on the side of Morgoth, the text reads, "And the elves do not forget it." To this day, they still carry a grudge. This is interesting because we're told that the Noldor of Middle-earth, the exiled Noldor, didn't participate in the War of Wrath. And since it's their written histories that comprise much of the First Age literature in the Silmarillion, we don't have a detailed account of the entire War of Wrath, because the exiled Noldor weren't there taking notes. In fact, once the host of Valinor, this huge army, lands in Middle-earth, it takes over 40 years to finally defeat Morgoth. Obviously, a lot had to happen during those 40 years, but it's not written down. But it culminates in this great battle, in this wasteland before the gates of Angband. We see what happened to the Balrogs, likely including the one we're familiar with, Durin's Bane. He was probably one of those few that fled and hid themselves in caverns, inaccessible at the roots of the earth. So it seems that Morgoth is finally going to get his comeuppance. But in his desperation, he has one last throw of the dice, and we get an incredibly cinematic finale to the War of Wrath. Then, seeing that his hosts were overthrown and his power dispersed, Morgoth quailed, and he dared not to come forth himself, but he loosed upon his foes the last desperate assault that he had prepared, and out of the pits of Angband there issued the winged dragons that had not before been seen, and so sudden and ruinous was the onset of that dreadful fleet that the host of the Valar was driven back, for the coming of the dragons was with great thunder and lightning, and a tempest of fire. But Earendil came, shining with white flame, and about Vingalot there gathered all the great birds of heaven, and Thorondor was their captain, and there was battle in the air all the day and through a dark night of doubt. Before the rising of the sun, Earendil slew Ancalagon the Black, the mightiest of the dragon host, and cast him from the sky. And he fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim, and they were broken in his ruin. Then the sun rose, and the host of the Valar prevailed, and well nigh all the dragons were destroyed. And all the pits of Morgoth were broken and unroofed, and the might of the Valar descended into the deeps of the earth. There Morgoth stood at last at bay, and yet unvaliant. He fled into the deepest of his mines, and sued for peace and pardon. But his feet were hewn from under him, and he was hurled upon his face. Then he was bound with the chain and Gainor, which he had worn aforetime, and his iron crown they beat into a collar for his neck, and his head was bowed upon his knees. And the 2 Silmarils which remained to Morgoth were taken from his crown, and they shone unsullied beneath the sky. And the Yanwe took them and guarded them. So we can thank Morgoth for having winged dragons. Sure, they wreak untold devastation and suffering, but they're winged dragons, come on! Including the mightiest winged dragon of them all, Calagon the Black, who gets name-checked by Gandalf in the Fellowship of the Ring. And this is the lasting image. Whenever an artist depicts the War of Wrath, they tend to show Earendil and his Silmaril aboard his flying ship, facing down an enormous, fire-breathing black dragon. When Earendil smites Calagon, knocking him out of the sky, he falls onto the towers of Thangorodrim, breaking them. Some people have used that evidence to suggest that Calagon is bigger than a mountain. I personally don't think we can make any specific size calculations based on that passage, other than he was a big dragon. But I doubt he was 50 times the size of Smaug or something that huge. One question that many readers have, including me, is did any of the Valar participate in the War of Wrath? We don't have any definitive proof, though we do know that some members of the Valar, such as Manwë, definitely stayed in the west. So if any did participate, it was on an individual basis. If I'm rating the likelihood of which of the Valar got involved, I put my money on Ulmo, who came to Middle-earth on multiple occasions, and Tulkas, the champion of the Valar. Tulkas personally beat Morgoth, at that time Melkor, hand-to-hand back during the Years of the Trees. And he was the one who originally chained Melkor with the chain of Angainor. The description from that last quote of Morgoth being hurled upon his face suggests Tulkas perhaps showed up for round 2. Maybe. So, Morgoth is captured, his crown is turned into a collar around his neck, and Eyanwe, the Maya spirit known as the Herald of Manwë, takes possession of the 2 remaining Silmarils. Thus, Middle-earth is saved. But it's saved at a great cost. This is from the chapter of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. In the great battle and the tumults of the fall of Thangorodrim, there were mighty convulsions in the earth, and Beleriand was broken and laid waste, and northward and westward many lands sank beneath the waters of the great sea. In the east, in Sirion, the walls of Ered were broken, and a great gap was made in them towards the south, and the gulf of the sea flowed in. Into that gulf the river Lune fell by a new course, and it was called therefore the Gulf of Lune. That country had of old been named Lindon by the Noldor, and this name it bore thereafter. And many of the Eldar still dwelt there, lingering, unwilling yet to forsake Beleriand, where they had fought and labored long. Upon the shores the elves built their havens and named them Mithlond, and there they held many ships, for the harborage was good. From the grey havens the Eldar ever and anon set sail, fleeing from the darkness of the days of earth. Others of the Eldar there were who crossed the mountains of Ered in that age and passed into the inner lands. Many of these were Teleri, survivors of Doriath and Sirion, and they established realms among the Sylvan elves in woods and mountains far from the sea, for which none the less they ever yearned in their hearts. So a huge swath of Beleriand gets flooded, and the sea now laps on the shores of Lindon, which used to be an inland region on the eastern portion of Beleriand. This is when the Grey Havens becomes a seaport. And now the war is over. These 6 battles have led up to the end of the First Age. And with Morgoth successfully sent to the void, the Valar forgive the exiled Noldor, and many elves return to the west with the Valar's blessing. But as we know, many elves also choose to stay. In those days there was a great building of ships upon the shores of the western sea, and thence in many a fleet the Eldar set sail into the west, and came never back to the lands of weeping and of war. And the Vanyar returned beneath their white banners, and were borne in triumph to Valinor. And when they came into the west, the elves of Beleriand dwelt upon Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle. They were admitted again to the love of Manwë and the pardon of the Valar. And the Teleri forgave their ancient grief, and the curse was laid to rest. Yet not all the Eldar were willing to forsake the hither lands where they had long suffered and long dwelt, and some lingered many an age in Middle-earth. Among those were Círdan the shipwright, and Celeborn of Doriath, with Galadriel his wife, who alone remained of those who led the Noldor to exile in Beleriand. In Middle-earth dwelt also Gil-galad the High King, and with him was Elrond half-elven, who chose, as was granted to him, to be numbered among the Eldar. But Elros his brother chose to abide with men. There we get a who's who of notable elves remaining in Middle-earth after the First Age. I also like that not only did the Valar forgive the returning Noldor, but the Teleri did as well. The Teleri forgave their ancient grief, and the curse was laid to rest. So, that's the state of elvendom, if that's a word, after the War of Wrath. What about humans? This is from the Akallabeth. In the great battle, when at last Morgoth was overthrown and Thangorodrim was broken, the Edain alone of the kindreds of men fought for the Valar, whereas many others fought for Morgoth. And after the victory of the lords of the west, those of the evil men who were not destroyed fled back into the east. Then the Valar forsook for a time the men of Middle-earth who had refused their summons and had taken the friends of Morgoth to be their masters. And men dwelt in darkness and were troubled by many evil things that Morgoth had devised in the days of his dominion. And the lot of men was unhappy. But Manwë put forth Morgoth, and shut him beyond the world in the void that is without. And he cannot himself return again into the world, present and visible, while the lords of the west are still enthroned. To the fathers of men of the three faithful houses, rich reward also was given. Eönwë came among them and taught them, and they were given wisdom and power and life more enduring than any others of mortal race have possessed. A land was made for the Edain to dwell in, neither part of Middle-earth nor of Valinor, for it was sundered from either by a wide sea. So there we see the gifts that the Edain received for fighting on the side of the Valar. Wisdom, a much longer lifespan, and Numenor. The Easterlings, who fought for Morgoth, did not fare so well. Tolkien includes the ominous line, "And the lot of men was unhappy." It's like, ugh. You can see then why the Easterlings might still resent the Númenóreans generations later. Those two groups came out of the war with significantly different prospects. Now we see how elves and men entered the Second Age. What about Sauron, Morgoth's chief lieutenant? He fought and lost, his master sent to the void. Sauron comes before Eönwë, and a very pivotal choice is made. This is also from the chapter of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. When Thangorodrim was broken and Morgoth overthrown, Sauron put on his fair hue again, and did obeisance to Eönwë, the herald of Manwë, and abjured all his evil deeds. And some hold that this was not at first falsely done, and that Sauron in truth repented, if only out of fear, being dismayed by the fall of Morgoth and the great wrath of the lords of the west. But it was not within the power of Eönwë to pardon those of his own order, and he commanded Sauron to return to Aman, and there receive the judgment of Manwë. Then Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation and to receive from the Valar a sentence, it might be, of long servitude in proof of his good faith. for under Morgoth his power had been great. Therefore, when Eonwë departed, he hid himself in Middle-earth, and he fell back into evil, for the bonds that Morgoth had laid upon him were very strong. The key line in that paragraph is, "But it was not within the power of Eonwë to pardon those of his own order." Eonwë and Sauron are both Maiar spirits of the same order. Essentially, they're peers. This is where it would have been handy to have a member of the Valar, a higher order, present. So instead of imprisoning Sauron and sending him to the west for judgment, Eonwë orders Sauron to head west, without any real threat of enforcement. Sauron seems repentant, but obviously he later changes his mind, and a whole bunch of people die as a result of that decision. On the one hand, I understand Eonwë's position. He's acting as the Valar would wish. But we did get in the earlier quote, "Manwë put forth Morgoth and shut him beyond the world in the void that is without." That means Eonwë and company brought Morgoth back to Valinor in chains to be judged. If Eonwë had authority to take Morgoth into custody, surely he'd be given the authority to restrain one of Morgoth's lieutenants? I suppose that line, "Sauron put on his fair hue again," suggests that Sauron duped Eonwë into believing he'd actually turn himself in. That worked out well. I have one more quote to read about the aftermath of the War of Wrath. There are actually more casualties that occur after the war is finished, and not just from the cataclysm that follows. There is, in fact, another deadly combat. We end with our final two surviving sons of Feanor, Maedhros and Maglor. They've seen and participated in much of the violence throughout the Wars of Beleriand, and throughout they've been driven by the need to fulfill their oath, to take back the Silmarils by any means necessary. Now, Eonwë has the two remaining Silmarils. Remember, one of them is sailing across the sky. The Sons of Feanor demand that Eonwë hand over the Silmarils, but he refuses, citing the evils they have committed in following their oath. Maglor tries to convince Maedhros to break their oath, but Maedhros, the eldest brother, decides otherwise. Silmarillion, Chapter 24. "If none can release us," said Maglor, "then indeed the everlasting darkness shall be our lot, whether we keep our oath or break it. But less evil shall we do in the breaking." Yet he yielded at last to the will of Maedhros, and they took counsel together how they should lay hands on the Silmarils. And they disguised themselves, and came in the night to the camp of Eonwë, and crept into the place where the Silmarils were guarded. And they slew the guards, and laid hands on the jewels. Then all the camp was raised against them, and they prepared to die, defending themselves until the last. But Eonwë would not permit the slaying of the sons of Feanor, and departing unfought, they fled far away. Each of them took to himself a Silmaril, for they said, "Since one is lost to us, and but two remain, and we two alone of our brothers, so it is plain that fate would have us share the heirlooms of our father." But the jewel burned the hand of Maedhros in pain unbearable, and he perceived that it was as Eonwë had said, and that his right thereto had become void, and that the oath was vain. And being in anguish and despair, he cast himself into a gaping chasm filled with fire, and so ended. And the Silmaril that he bore was taken into the bosom of the earth. And it is told of Maglor that he could not endure the pain with which the Silmaril tormented him, and he cast it at last into the sea. And thereafter he wandered ever upon the shores, singing in pain and regret beside the waves. And thus it came to pass that the Silmarils found their long homes, one in the airs of heaven, one in the fires of the heart of the world, and one in the deep waters. And so, the Wars of Beleriand end with this final act of violence. I suppose in one way the wars end when all three Silmarils are returned to their elements. Feanor's oath and the doom of Mandos have finally played out. I've really enjoyed making this video and the entire series on the Wars of Beleriand. I think doing this series has really shown me a lot of the roots of the strife that is to come thousands of years later during the War of the Ring. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!